Welcome, everybody, back to Intro to VCarve. This is part 4. We're going to be talking about working with 3D models in VCarve. Now, I say working with 3D models because in VCarve, you're not able to actually create models, although there are a lot of editing capabilities. And that's what I'm really going to go into tonight, talk about how you can combine multiple models, work with individual models. This is just kind of a quick picture of one of the projects we're going to talk about tonight, where you actually combine 3 separate models into a finished project. But before we get there, I want to back up to a couple of topics that we touched on in the past, and I'll be talking more about during the presentation tonight. But one of them is understanding and managing layers. I didn't deal with that specifically. I did reference it, but I've got a couple of slides here. These will be in your handout as well, so you can reference them. Kind of like a couple other slides I've showed you, it kind of packs in a lot of information into one item. If you choose to work with layers, and it's not a requirement, but they're really helpful when you get into more complex designs with lots of vectors and lots of 3D models, but it can get confusing also. The best way to think of it is that it's transparent sheets of paper, and on each sheet of paper, you can have different information. So this really comes out of the drafting industry, engineering, architecture, where they actually would design different parts of a house on different layers, and they would lay them over each other to see how they aligned. But if they just wanted to look at the first floor plan, they could pull that out. Within VCarve, you have the ability, and you'll see me do this tonight, where you're copying and moving stuff from layer to layer. You can turn layers on and off with these light bulbs. You can relabel them. You can assign different colors to the layers, which then will change the color of the vectors on that layer. And there's some additional items there. This detailed slide here gives you what each one of those do. So I encourage you to go in and play around with layers a little bit if you think you need them. Like I said, they usually come in useful if you have information that you're trying to hide, like some vectors or some bitmap layer. You want to hide that. You can turn off the visibility of that and hide your photos. You can resort these. There's lots of different things you can do with these. So this shows you what all the different icons do. And like I said, I'll include this in the handout I send you. You have a chance to study that. If there's anything, that you're confused about here, there is that. I don't have it in this picture, but there's that little question mark icon that pops up at the top of the field that I've mentioned before, where it'll take you out to VCarve website, where they give a full rundown and additional explanation of this. Or you can also drop me an email if you're having an issue with layers. The other thing I want to touch on is any questions about layers?
I have a question.
Yeah.
What's the difference between layers and sheets?
So layers, think of layers as layers of paper. Think of sheets as sheets of plywood. So a sheet of plywood, you're only going to cut into a certain group of pieces. You can't reuse that. So whatever you have on a sheet of plywood gets cut out of that. So sheets are actually set up as sheets of material, separate sheets of material, and vectors exist on a separate sheet. So they're similar in that sense, but you can't lay a sheet on top of each other and see the sheet below it. It's like laying out sheets of material or plywood in your shop and drawing. Okay. You draw on each sheet separately.
All right.
So yeah, it gets kind of complicated there with working together. But once you work with the two of them and understanding that difference, they have a different role that way. Next, I want to touch on climb versus conventional cut. This is something that comes up in profile cutting primarily, but also in pocket cutting. And the basic understanding of it that I mentioned previously is that climb cutting and conventional cutting is the traditional way that you would push a router or you would push your work. Now, I got to stop here and pause. I think I have a mistake in this picture. Let's see here. This feed direction, double check here. I just noticed this. Yeah, the feed direction arrows, I believe, are going the wrong way here. I will correct that before I send that out to you. The idea, let's start with the conventional cut. the idea of the conventional cut is you're actually pushing your work towards the cutter. And so it's taking chunks out. And as it does that, let me get my other laser pointer. As it rotates up like that, it's lifting the grain off the top, and that's where you get the chip out. However, because you're feeding your wood. Okay, so let's take another look at this. The feed direction here refers to the router bit, okay? If this was on a router table, you would be pushing the wood against the router bit, but the router bit feed direction is still going into the wood. So maybe a little clarity on what that means, but so in a way, feed direction is correct, but it's really referring to the router bit going into the material. Same thing over here. The feed direction is referring to the router bit pushing into the material. In this case, it's chopping down at the top of the wood. So rather than lifting up, it's chopping down, and that way it helps to eliminate chipping, especially when you go around the corner of a board. However, when you use this as a handheld router, you can see it's like a wheel. It's going to grab that and take off on you, or on your router table, it would grab it and shoot it out the other end. So you have to be very careful if you're doing this manually with a handheld router on a router table. But on a CNC router, you don't have that concern because the power of the machine holds it back and prevents it from self-feeding itself. And so it's really useful when working in solid wood. And as a rule of thumb, I recommend using climb cut in solid lumber and conventional cut in pretty much all other materials. There are some special situations where if you watch how it cuts, you may decide to change that up. And one way you can figure that out is go ahead and run a couple of tests in your material. So set up a pocket. 2 by 5 inches is big enough probably, or you could go bigger, but something that gives you a little length and some quarters, and then set up a conventional and a climb cut for a pocket cut. And then go ahead and cut it out, and you can set it up both as an offset or as a raster and test it both ways and see how it cuts. And what you're looking for is, what's the finished surface look like? Do you get a better cut with conventional or climb cut? In some materials, you're not going to see any difference. In some, you'll notice a significant difference. The other thing that affects it can also be the kind of router bit you're using. If you're using a straight bit, like a straight fluted straight bit, or if you're using a climb or a compression bit or a down spiral, whatever your flute configuration can also affect some of these results. Now, pocketing and profile cutting, a straight end mill is the most common bit to be used in those two tool paths. But you can also use a profile bit. You could use V bits. You could use Baldo's bits. So they all still apply. They can all still be run in conventional incline. When you have that option, it's worth doing some testing to get familiar with that. But if you're just starting out, broad rule of thumb, climb cut for solid lumber and conventional for pretty much everything else. Another test you can run using the profile tool path is cut out some circles, or they could be squares also. I kind of like circles because then you get every possible option of grain interaction. You get at an angle, straight on, and parallel. And then the other thing that I've done with these two setups, and again, this will be in your handouts, is this little offset option we've talked about, where you can take a final pass to do a trim pass. You could practice doing or test it with going the opposite direction of the main cut to see what kind of feature that has. So if you're set up at climb cut, then it'll do a conventional cut on the last pass if you have that checked. So again, go ahead and study this. A few tests on a couple different materials will be highly educational, and it's well worth doing to see what it looks like. I've talked to some cabinet makers, and sometimes they'll simply run out a couple of squares of material, squares on their material, and they'll look at the outside or the inside of the line, and they'll pick whichever one is better. That's the one they go with. So like I said, it kind of depends sometimes on the plywood or the material that you're cutting and the type of router bit. Any questions about climb versus conventional? Well, next up, I'm going to give you a quick lineup of the demos we're going to do tonight. And then we're going to jump over to the software and pretty much spend the rest of the evening for this presentation in the demo software rather than more here, because I really want to do this live because it's much easier to follow. But again, kind of picking up where we left off last week, I'm going to do a quick follow-up demo and review on text on a curve. There is one situation where text in a circle becomes a little tricky, and I'm going to kind of explain to you why it's a little trickier than doing it on a single curve. So we'll look at that, and then we'll hop into the 3D material, which is going to talk, I'm going to go over an understanding of the basic shapes, basic 3D shapes that you deal with in VCarve. We're going to look at how do you combine 3D models with other toolpaths that get creative designs like this sign. Then we're going to look at combining multiple 3D models into a single model. All this is done in VCarve. You don't need Aspire for any of this. And then the final thing we'll look at is actually creating some custom 3D shapes within VCarve. There are some limits here, but I've combined a couple of shapes here to create a custom shape. And it's surprising how much you can do within VCarve. And if you really get into this and really enjoy this, then you might explore Aspire. It's a big price jump, but you can always download the software from VCarve, and you could learn all the modeling you want just off that trial software. And then if you decide to upgrade, you can upgrade. Toolpaths remain the same in both the software, but Aspire has a lot more 3D capabilities because you can actually create a truly unique original shape. You could create that fish you could model out that fish in Aspire where you can't do that in VCarve.
So is that for VCarve desktop too?
Yes, everything I covered tonight, let me think about this a minute. Yes, everything I covered tonight, you'll be able to do in desktop as well.
Okay, so all those examples that's in VCarve are available to use in desktop.
So yes, that would be one slight difference. So the clip art, we'll look at that here in a minute. The clip art library in VCarve desktop is a little bit more limited than the model library in VCarve Pro. So you do get more models with VCarve Pro. However, all those models, if you go out to the Vectric website, if you like, say this fish is in both programs. But if this fish wasn't in desktop, you could go out to Vectric website and purchase the fish and bring it into desktop. So desktop comes with a certain number of clip arts, but that's not limited to only using those. You can have everything you buy off of Vectric website will work in desktop.
So I guess I was told when I bought it, they said that you can carve 3Ds, but you can't create 3Ds with desktop. Is that correct?
Yes, in the broadest sense of the word, you can carve them, but you can't create like that fish. You can't create that fish in VCarve desktop or VCarve Pro. However, VCarve desktop and VCarve Pro have a has a very large ability to combine models and edit them. So you can change them in certain ways, size, proportions, interactions, kind of like this picture I'm showing you. And that's a lot of what I'm going to show you tonight. So yeah, well, go ahead and hang tight here. And as I go through this, it's obvious you're thinking about this. Feel free, bring up any other questions you have related to working with this in VCarve. Okay, with that, let's open up the first, let's see what else, check here. Okay, yeah, let's open up the first demo, which actually is going to be talking about text in a circle. Bring that over. Okay, so I'm going to take a look at this design. And in here, I've got the basics laid out. I've got some text, and I've got 3 separate lines of text. They're all the same size. And the challenge here is to place this text inside these circles so that looks like what I have right here. So I'm going to start with placing the first one, this side up, and then I need to hold the shift key down and select, that's the vector I'm going to use. Now the tool for this is over here where it says text on a curve. And when I open that up, since I had both of those selected, it automatically popped it into the circle. If I didn't have them selected, you could do it after you open up this tool. But again, notice it says a single line of text, so you can't have any returns in your text. It has to be a single line. And then you select the vector that you want to place it on. Now, here's the primary challenge that comes up when you try to place this on a circle. So I've placed it, this side up is showing here at the bottom. Obviously, I want this on the top. So I go down my list here, and the first thing I'm looking at here is I've got above the curve. Well, it looks like it's on the right side of the curve that I want it on. It's kind of on that inside circle, so I'm okay with that. Obviously, if I placed it on these other ones, it's going to start popping some weird places. So I'm going to leave it right there. But I really want it on the other side. I want it on the top up here. So I'm going to try to hit text on other side. Well, it actually doesn't solve it. And if I do left alignment, well, that doesn't solve it. Middle is where it was and right is where it was. So I'm having trouble in this setup. Whatever I do, what you're going to find out, it's not going to get it where you want it. So this is probably the most common email I get from people as to why won't it do this. Now, I'm going to show you the quick fix first. The quickest fix is to grab this little green button, this little node right down here. I've got it set up to middle, okay? So I'm going to grab that node or that point right there, and I'm going to right click, and I'm just going to slide this up to the middle like that. Then I need to, let's put the text on the other side. So I got it right side up, but now I'm on the wrong side of the circle. So then I'm going to go below the circle, and now I'm where I want it. Now, it's several steps in there, but the main secret point is remembering that this green start point right here, or alignment point, is what you can grab and move it around. And then from here, I can go in and I can adjust the size. I certainly don't want to do that, but let's go in and I can adjust the spacing a little bit. And scale the text. That's too big, so let's scale it back. And I can even use the roller key on my mouse just to roll that up and down till I like the size. Okay, so I've got that pretty much where I want it. Now, here's the reason that it's jumping to the wrong side. If I take a circle and I go inside Node Edit, see this green point? That's called the start point. And if I grab this arc, see we have a green point over here. So I'm going to start at the most basic setup. I'm going to grab that text and that arc, and let's go back to the basic default settings. My arc has a start point, which is over here in the left. That's the left end of the line. And so when I select my text and I tell it to go to the left end, see it goes to the left end. If I tell it to go to the right end, it goes to the right end. And if I tell it to go to the middle, it goes to the middle. So what happens when I grab that text and I put it on this circle and it's going to the bottom? The reason it's going to the bottom is that circle, as I showed you, also has a start point. So if I place this text on the left side, notice how it aligns to the left half of this circle because that's the start point. If I go to the right side, it goes to the right. That's the same thing as that right end of the line. Or it defaults to the middle. Another way to look at this is if I go into Node Edit, I go over that here. Let's do this. I select that line. I go into Node Edit with the right click or the N key of the keyboard. I go over that node right there and I hit Cut Vector. Now, nothing looks like it's changed, but if I right click or left click on that and drag that, now you can see how I really have one single line. It's got some arcs to it, but this, now you can see how this is the left end and that is the right end. So now if I go back into that text and my text on a curve, select that curve, and I hit left, it goes up to that side or it goes up to that right side. So that's why when you lay it out on a circle, we go over to this circle here, and I go into Node Edit, notice how that start point is at the top. So the middle of this circle is the bottom. So when I select that text and that circle, and I put middle, it's putting it at the bottom. So back to where I started, the easiest way to move this around is just grab that, bring it up to the top, play with your settings, and flip it around. That is, like I say, the easiest way to handle that. So let's go into this one now and edit it a little bit. Let's take that text size down a little bit. And let's increase the spacing a little bit. Notice when I increase the spacing, it decreases the text size. So let's increase the, and we'll go with that for now. Now I can take my next text, and this one pops right to the bottom because that's where we want it. So that works out well. Let's go ahead and scale that down. And I'll add a little spacing to that. I'll just accept that for right now. Now on this middle one, this is where it gets a little interesting too. Notice my text. I want this to be a continual phrase all the way around. So it's round and round and round and, because I got to be continuous. So I'm going to select that and then select my inner vector right here. And now we can see that it's compressed all the way around. So if I scale it to fit, now what happens is it certainly is fitting all the way to the end, but I have no space between those. And I need a little bit of space there. So I'm going to back this up just like that. Now with that, my spacing between the letters is a little tight. So I'm going to just increase the spacing a little bit. And I'm pretty good right there. So with that, I'm going to stop on this and close out of that. Now, when you want to go in and do a little fine tuning, let's start with this side up here. My T and H, all these letters are a little bit spaced out, a little bit extra space in there. All I have to do is go back to my primary text tool, take the cursor over here, and you notice how it's changing now to a symbol. You see the middle two dark triangles are pointing inward. So if I left click it decreases that space. And then I could keep clicking and keep clicking that down. Now, if you want it to move more quickly or a larger amount, hold the control key down and it jumps a lot. And if you want to push it outward, hold the shift key down and it'll go back outward. If you want it to go outward a lot, hold the shift and the control key down and then it jumps a lot. So you have a lot of control over this. Again, those commands, you can review this video. They're also available. If you go to this question mark right here, that'll bring up the Vectric website. It'll show you all those shortcut keys as well. And then the same thing we could do down here. We could go into the round over. We could, compress things if we see like the R and the O and all these are a little far apart. And we can, this is a little far apart, this are a little bit more spacing than here. So we could go in here and add the shift key and adding spacing between these will compress the end. You can't do any spacing at the end. Notice the tool doesn't come up. So in this situation, to control this spacing, I have to add or delete space between the letters, and that then compresses this end space a little bit. So the text on a curve is quite powerful. I've added these vectors. Let's close out of this. I added this vector right here where the letter is sitting on. That's not a vector that I use for carving. I'm using these outer two here for carving the edge. I have those added right now as kind of a manual reference for the offset. But as we talked about last time, if I go inside text on a curve, I can add additional offset if I want to add a 1/4 inch offset. Notice now how it's lifted it off that line a little bit. So again, there's multiple ways to get the same job done inside VCarve. Any questions about text on a circle or a curve?
Yeah, Randy, how did you pull up that tool for the spacing?
For the spacing?
Yeah.
Yes. So I exit out of text on a curve. It's the basic text tool right over here in the left. When you
Right.
click on that, and then I go over and I select some of my text by clicking on it. That can be a little tricky. You have to get right on it. When the text is selected, or you can also select it before you open the Create Text tool. It works either way. Then when you hold your cursor, like right here, my cursor is a standard cursor. When you slide that down between the tools, it turns into that spacing tool.
Okay, I got it.
And you just click on it to make it closer or wider. Any other questions? Okay, then let's let me bring up the next one. We're going to jump into the 3D modeling next. So one of the first things to understand about 3D models inside of VCarve or the Vectric software in general is that the model is actually built out of pixels of information, much like this toy that you see here. So inside a model, and we'll zoom into one when we get into it later, but it's actually made up of a lot of pixels of imagery, and based on the height, it lifts it up to create the shape. So in some ways, it's more like a bitmap than a vector. And to the extent that it's like a bitmap, just like a photograph, when you blow it up really large, it'll get pixelated, or we used to call it grainy in the old days of paper photography. It'll get grainy, you'll lose resolution. The same thing applies to a 3D model. So it is possible to enlarge a 3D model and lose detail because it just gets so pixelated. And these four samples up here kind of represent some of the basic shapes that you might have for 3D models. And I'm going to start out just talking about the basic fish here. You can find a lot of 3D models inside your clip art library, clip art, and I'll go down to animals. And to bring one into your drawing, all you need to do is click on the model and it brings it right in. Let's split this up here. And so here is your basic fish model. Now you can work with it either in the 3D window or the 2D. You can manually stretch it in one and it'll stretch it in the other. You notice when it goes off the material, it disappears. It's one of the things about 3D models you have to be aware of. It's still visible in the 2D. Like I can move this over here in the 2D and still see it, but it's not visible in the 3D. And so that's the basic fish model. Now, another option we have, and I'm going to go into more detail on this, but there's a cool little feature inside of your design panel. Down here are your 3D model tools. It's a limited selection, and we're going to cover a few of these tonight. But the first one is adding a plane component. Now, let's talk a little bit about what we're looking at here. This fish is what's called the 3D model, or it's called a component. 3D model and component are kind of interchangeable terms. The model might be referred to as everything together, and the components are separate 3D models within that total design. We also have this light brown background, and this is referred to as the modeling plane. Notice how when I turn on edge, it disappears because there's no thickness to it. In fact, there's no thickness, there's no mass. Think of it as your work table. But there's, for practical purpose in the modeling world, VCarve doesn't see it. It's just a working surface. You can also toggle this on and off under view up here. There's lots of settings up here where it says draw modeling plane. If I turn that off, my modeling plane disappears. The value of having it on, of course, is you can see the size of your material. Now, as I said, this has no thickness, no volume or anything. But over here, we have this tool that's called Add a Plane Component with 0 height. When I click on this, notice how this turns brighter color. That's because we actually have a background now. You can think of it as a piece of veneer. If I click on it, I can actually move it. And you can see now, we can still see our modeling plane and our material. And that plane, which is often called a 0 plane, actually has some mass to it. It looks like part of the model. Anyway, I'll bring it back in the middle here. And now in this situation, we have sort of the situation we have right here. The difference is that this model is sitting on top of something thicker. So let's go in and we'll take this first little edit opportunity here. We have a window called components. And when I open this up, I have added what's up here called the 0 plane. And components, this is your list of various objects that you have in your drawing. And I have several here. Most of them are hidden, but the 0 plane with the checkbox, notice I can turn on and off. It disappears and it comes back. I can do the same thing with the bass, turn it on and off. But the interesting thing about the 0 plane is I can turn that into a piece of material just by giving it some thickness. In this case, I'm going to give it a thickness of a 1/2 inch. Tab, hit the tab button. Notice now that it actually has some thickness and the fish is sitting on top of it. So I've just now created a plaque with the fish on top of it. In this window, I'm editing the 0 plane. So I'm going to change the name of this to material, since it's no longer a 0 plane, it's actually a piece of material. And notice how it changes down here on the left side also. My bass right now is sitting on top of that. But in the world of 3D modeling, you want to think of this as a layer cake. Okay, you got the bottom layer, you got the net, you put some frosting on it, you put another layer on it, put some more frosting, and they stack on top of each other. So generally, you want to order these in the order that you want to build your project. So in this case, I want this bass to be on top of my material. Even though it looks fine here, I'll show you something in a minute. When I push this on top of my material, notice that my bass disappeared. So the order that these appear in here make a difference. The reason my bass disappeared is notice the little symbol at the beginning here. We have several symbols along the top, and this symbol right here is called the merge. Merging is a little like you walking into the water at the lake and your body disappears into the water. And if the water is deeper than your body's going to go under the water. And that's what's happened here because our fish is only, I want to make that a 1/4 inch thick, and our material is a 1/2 inch thick. Inside the material. So this is probably one of the trickiest things to initially learn about modeling is how to combine them. But if you think of it as a layer cake and realize that the combine mode, this symbol here means something, in this case, the merge drops it into it. I want to add that fish to the top of my material. So I'm going to click on add, and it pops the fish to the top, just like you would expect a layer cake. Then if we look at this next item up here, obviously that is depressed. So another option we have here is called subtract. And if I subtract that, it then subtracts the fish from the top area. And we're going to go look at more of these combined modes as we go along here. But this last one is actually making use of a couple of options. So let's take this fish and we're going to change that back to a add mode. And then I'm going to go back into my clip art. Zoom out here a minute. I'm going to go into my domes and dishes. And I'm going to grab this dome and I'm going to double click on it. And if we look at what we have here, it is a dome and it's sticking out. But it's also green. And why is it green? Well, let's go look at the component window. And here's the dome. It's also on merge. So the dome is sitting down inside our material, and the fish is sitting down inside the dome. So they're all kind of merging together right now. So let's undo that with the Control Z. Now, the reason the fish pops up here as the fish mode is set to add with the material, but the dome mode is set to merge with both of those. So again, gets a little bit complicated or confusing when you first start working with this. But if you keep your eye on what do I want this to look like? Well, I want the dome to subtract. So let's try subtract. And there the dome now subtracts. And the fish is laying in the bottom of the dome, which is kind of nice. That's kind of how we want it. I'm going to take that fish, see if I can select that. Actually, I'll go over here and select it. And select it one more time, and I'm going to move it over a little bit. Now, one other thing that this picture is showing me that is this light color. And the reason for this light color is that even though we can't see it in this illustration, this dome is thicker than our material. So that's a warning sign. So let's look at our setup here. Down at the bottom, we're in 3/4 inch material. So that means I'm going to go ahead and make a couple of changes here. I'm going to go back into my components. I'm going to open up my material, and I'm going to match the thickness of my material with the thickness of my job setup. So this 3D model now is identical to my job setup. And notice what that did now. It made my material thicker, and the dome is doing pretty good, although I still see a little light right there. So let's take a look at the dome. And this kind of explains it here. The dome here is 0.8, so it's too thick. It's going through the bottom of the material. So let's make that 0.5. And that brings the dome up. I've got a fish sitting in the bottom of it, and everything looks pretty good right there. Okay, I know that covered a lot, and you'll probably have to re-look at the video to catch up with that, but I'm also going to re-demonstrate this along the way. But before we move on, any questions or comments that you want for questions for clarity or anything? We'll also take a look, at this point, I'll take a quick look at tool paths. And the most general setup for tool paths involve using the roughing tool path for 3D models. And sometimes, so what popped up here is actually called the material setup window. That will often pop up the first time you run a 3D tool path. Everything looks fine here. I'm not getting any errors. But notice that if I had my material, let's say I had to put my material at 1 inch. Notice how now on the right side, I'm getting an error because it's showing me my total model thickness is 1 inch and my material is only 3/4. So then when you get this error, you have to go back and adjust all or one of these to fix that before you carve it. And the opposite is also true. If I made my material 0.5, my 3D model, notice over here in the right side, I now have a light gray area or brown area. That represents my total model thickness of my block of wood, my dish, and my fish. And I can then push that to the top, which will leave me some extra 1/4 inch material at the back, or I can push it to the bottom, which means I have to carve off the entire top. So you always want to take a peek at this window before you save your tool paths to make sure this window is set up the way you want it. Now, I've jumped ahead into some pretty advanced editing here, and I'm going to back off here the next couple demonstrations to show you some more basic stuff, but I wanted to kind of give you an overview of this. And let's do one tool path here before we leave, or rather, now we're back to our roughing tool path. I've got a 1/4 inch set up here. I'm going to do the entire model, which means it'll do the entire surface. We'll talk more detail on this. I'm just hit calculate. And here you can see the tool path. If we preview that, it roughs out the middle. That's the rough right there. Let me enlarge that. And then we'll go back and do the finishing tool path again. I'll just accept the basic settings I have here, calculate that out. And preview that. And that's a preview of what your actual carving would look like. So I mentioned this before also. This, what I'm looking at right now is your model preview. And because we actually have a model in here, we're actually seeing the model. If I were to turn off one of these, let's turn the material off, then I would have that part of it and I would have that part of it. So this is your model view, your 3D view up here in the upper, you see that tab. This is your 3D model view or your material view. When you open this window up, this becomes your actual toolpath view to show you what it's going to look like when you actually carve it. So you'll notice in here, we've got some little roundovers along the fins. You know, it's a little bit of a fillet because of the diameter of the router bit. If we go back to the model preview, everything looks really crisp. And that's because this is the actual model, but by the time you carve it, going back to that view, you lose a little bit of detail based on the diameter of your router bit. But this toolpath preview window is critically valuable because what you see here is what you will get at your machine. And I'm going to say 99.9% of the time. So it's really valuable that way. So with that, I'm going to hop off to the next.
What was the, how long did it take to carve that?
Oh, let's check this out. This so this is 12 by 12. So I'm at about, I'm going to say I'm somewhere between an hour and a half and 2 hours with this estimate.
Okay. So do you do you pick the tool or does it automatically when you have the carving?
So
Was the
yeah.
tool already selected?
You mean for these tool paths?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you will select the tool. In this case, if I reopen this one, I have the end mill 1/4 inch up here, which is a pretty common bit for doing the roughing. But you'll click select, just like what last week we talked about setting these tool paths up, and you'll go locate the bit that you want to use. And like, you know, on most carvings of this size on a sharp tool, a 1/4 inch end mill is a pretty good choice. Another option, you could also use a 1/2 inch end mill. I've used that as well. And then you set up your feeds and speeds and hit select, and then that'll be applied. On the finishing one, you'll typically pick a ball nose bit. In this case, I've selected a very small ball nose bit, but 1/4 inch and 1/8 inch are other options that you can select as well. Does that help?
Yep, thank you.
Great. Okay, let's close out of that one. I'm going to bring up the next one. Okay, so this is the design that I've already ran once, and I want to show you some things on this. Primarily what I'm focused on here is I want to talk a bit about toolpath setup and combining toolpaths. Now notice on this one, if we look over here at the 3D view over here, that all I have in here is this 3D model right here. I didn't put a zero plate in. I didn't put anything in here. This will still work out fine if that's all I have, and then I have all these other vectors. So you could actually add a 3D piece. Now in this case, notice how that is going. If you could, let me enlarge that, go like this. That is going underneath the modeling plane. And that's because this design is even, let's take a look at the, see the duck? Now, combine mode is set to low. Now, that is a custom setting. It may not be necessary. Let me try another thing here. There. Actually, I wanted this to add. Notice how it's still below right there. And that's fine because I can tell that's going into the material. This is my modeling plane. This design was designed as a subtract. This is where it gets, you sometimes have to play with this back and forth of the design modes or the combined modes, because sometimes if it's designed as a subtract, you have to add it to get it to show. And sometimes if it's designed as an add, you have to subtract it to get it to show correctly. So there's no, I mean, there is there is reasons behind that, but usually what I tell people is just play around with these settings to get the visuals to show correctly. And at least when you're starting out, just start there. There are some more advanced techniques for changing that up, but that's all you really need to know is I'm right clicking here, combine mode, or I can open by double clicking on that, I can open up and play around with my settings here as well. But this again is a default setting or a default image that came from my clip art. Open up my toolpaths here. And obviously I have my roughing and my finishing toolpath here set up just to carve that design. And we'll take a look at that in a minute. So let's split this up here. We're going to go in like this. So first off, I've got my vector set up. I've also noticed this was a hand drawing, and I selected that hand drawing and did my bitmap trace to create that little log cabin. I just got that off of a hand drawing. So if we preview, let's go to preview here, mode. And I'm going to preview the quarter holes. I wonder if I split this the other way, if it'll be easier to see. This might be. Let's go like this. So I've got the quarter holes. You can see here the vectors. Again, a valuable thing to know is that when I highlight a toolpath on the right side, that's called selected toolpath. And when you select that, it will automatically highlight the vectors on the left side that are associated with that. So notice that when I go to the cabin 60 degree and I click on that, notice how these turn pink, because those are the vectors that are associated with that toolpath. I can now click on preview. It'll do the cabin. I can now that's a 60 degree bit because I wanted a lot of detail like I talked about last time. Now the border and the text, when I select that, notice I can select these at the same time. And I can carve them both at the same time with one toolpath. Those are highlighted, so I can preview those. And then my texturing, notice for my texturing, let's enlarge this one. For my texturing, I want to keep the texture away from my letters a little bit. I want to keep it away from the 3D model and away from the log cabin. So I've added that offset to those shapes. On the V-carve of the edge, I want it to go right up to that. So I'm selecting that vector.
You guys okay in there?
And so,
What's
so then I go ahead and I have the texture set up with those offset vectors. So when it carves it won't overcarve my main part. So let's go back and look at the we're going to look at the texture. Now, the texture toolpath, I can see it here in my 3D view, and you can see it here how it's staying away from the log cabin. It's not as visible in the 2D view, but you can still see the vectors that are selected. Let's go ahead and we'll preview the texture. So again, like I said, by adding a little offset, it keeps it away from the letters and the log cabin and around the outside of the carving, but it goes right up to that outer V-carve, which is what I wanted. So finally, we're going to do the 3D toolpath for the roughing for the model. I'm going to open that up and show you a difference. Last time in the upper right here, we had model boundary set up, but our whole project was the model last time. Now it's just this part of it that's the model. And so when model boundary is set up, in this case, it's going to restrict the carving just to where the model is. So that's one of the advantages of doing it this way is I only have carving in that part of it, so I don't need to 3D carve the rest of my project. And so that's set up like that. We can preview that. Notice again here, I get, against the grain perhaps with the roughing, which I like to do that with the roughing. So that roughs that out. And then by 3D finishing, that's going to go the other direction. You can see how let's zoom in here. You can kind of see it going left and right there. So that's going to go the other direction. And you can see there how it's going to go down through that to finish it off. So with a little bit of planning ahead, you're able to combine a wide variety of components, 3D model shapes, vectors, lettering, V-carving, texturing into the same picture. And then if you want to even go further than that, you can apply some of the things we looked at in previous evenings where we talked about setting these at different cutting heights. I could put this whole inner drawing, I could drop that down inside a pocket if I wanted to and have a frame around it. So you can get very custom with your designs, and you're doing this all within VCarve Pro with just the basic tools that are included. Like I said, outside of creating, like if you wanted to create this duck yourself, you will need a Spire. But if you don't have the need to create original 3D artwork, VCarve and VCarve Pro will do pretty much everything else you need. So sometimes people are anxious to upgrade to Aspire, and I caution them, unless you're really up for that learning curve, I simply tell people don't bother till you gain a lot more experience. Till you can master everything I show you tonight, don't bother upgrading. Just enjoy VCarve Pro for a while. Any questions about this design?
I got one question about the cabin.
Yeah,
You said that was a hand drawing you pulled in.
yes.
How did you pull that in? And did you manually trace it or auto trace?
I auto traced it. So I did this drawing with a Sharpie on a piece of white typing paper. I then took a photograph of it with my cell phone. And then that photograph is a JPEG, which is a type of bitmap. And I imported that using this feature right here, which is import bitmap. And so even though it looks like a black and white drawing here, it's really a black and white, it's a photograph. And then I enlarged it to whatever, to the size I wanted it. But then I used the trace tool like this, open this up. And there's I've got that selected. You see how there's the pink dotted line? That means that this one is selected. I have black and white. I'm going to just accept the default settings and hit preview and apply and close. And I'm going to select my bitmap and drag that away. And there my vectors are right there.
Okay, I think I got it.
So what kind of a tool did you use to do the texture?
Ah, good question. Yes. So if I open the texture up, that's a 1/2 inch bulldoze. So it's a 1/2 inch bulldoze. Let me get the right one here. Yeah, that's it. Let's see here. Wonder if I've got this came over from another piece of software, so I may not, let's just create the settings for it. But yeah, it's a bulldoze, 1/2 inch diameter. And then what gives you the uniqueness of that, let's actually, I'm going to close out. I'll come back to this just a second. I want to bring up the preview window. Here we go. And then I'm going to bring up the texture window. I guess we can't see both of them at the same time. Actually, I could go back to this one. There we go. We'll look at this picture. So within the texturing toolpath, you then have to set up these options here. And so the first one refers to how deep it's going to cut. So a maximum depth of cut is 1/10 of an inch. And I rarely texture deeper than that with most of these bits. What you see, again, what you see here is pretty much what you're going to get on your design. The other thing you have to realize is that this texturing takes place in one pass. So if I did that at 1/4 of an inch, it's going to pass 1/4 of an inch deep in one pass. It doesn't do it in multiple swipes. So you have to be a little bit aware of that with the later duty benchtop tools. There's also some variation here. So maximum depth. So you're setting it at 0.1, but you could do a maximum depth, or I'm sorry, minimum depth is what you're setting this at. So it will, and you can set whatever the minimum depth. So it's always cutting to a certain depth. So the range will be from the minimum depth to the maximum depth. And then you have a cut length. In this case, I've got 2 inches. And then I've got a minimum length of 1 inch approximately. So again, all the strokes will be between 1 and 2 inches where possible. Now, there's some places that it's not possible, particularly up right against the details of the edge, as you can see. But in the main stroke area, it will be minimum 1, maximum 2. And then overlap, you can kind of think of overlap as how much the one end is going to overlap with the other end. So how much is the 1 inch going to overlap with the 2 inch? And then you also have step over, which we've talked about. That's strictly, stepping over your lawnmower. How much is it going to step over with each pass? And then these also have variations to give you that randomness. And then you've got the angle. So the other thing too, just to point out here, is that if you like this, you could actually, let's see, does it have it in here? Yeah, right here, where you see where it says save. If you, with all these settings, since it takes a while to figure out the ones that look good, if you like it, you could save this out as a toolpath template, and then you can reload it later. So it have all of your settings pre-made. So you could have a texture set up for a 1/2 inch bit, a 1/4 inch bit, a 1 inch bit, a V bit, whatever kind of bit you're using for texturing. So as I mentioned earlier, we think of this as a layer cake, starting with the material at the bottom. Let's split this up again, and we'll take our layer here at the bottom. And again, we've got a modeling plane here. We are going to build on this modeling plane. And the first thing I'm going to add to this will be what's referred to as a zero plane. So I've created that just like we created before. I'm going to go inside my component window to find it. And there's my zero plane. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to rename it. And then I'm also going to double click on it and open up the edit window for it. And I'm going to give it some base height. So I'm going to give this, we're looking at our material, it says 1 inch. So I'm going to call this 1 inch, hit the tab key to apply it, and then close out of that. So now I have a block of wood. This is it's actually a 3D model of my project. Now, as I showed you in the duck project, you don't always have to add that. And even for this one, I wouldn't have to add this, but it just makes simulating it and visualizing it so much easier to start that way. Next, we want to add a dish. So I'm going to go back into my clip art. Open up the library, find the domes and dishes, click on domes and dishes right here, and insert that. Now we have to do a little editing on this. And so let's go into design. You could edit the XY dimensions of these using the tools inside of these transform tools. So if I go into set size, and we look over here at our drawing, this dish is supposed to be 9 inches in diameter. So I'm going to leave the link XY checked and change this to 9 inches. And it changes both of them. Now, when you're dealing with a 3D model, notice this auto scale Z. This checkbox only applies when you're dealing with 3D models. This does not apply with standard 2D vector lines. What this AutoZ does, now that I have it checked, it auto scales the thickness based on increasing the proportions of the X and Y. You may or may not want to do that automatically. There are times where you want to change the X and Y, but you don't want the thickness of your object to change. However, if you accidentally leave this checked, you obviously can hit Control Z and go back and uncheck it. But if you're working in your project and you realize one of your objects is too thick that you made larger like this, let's hit apply. There it goes. Notice now that it's thicker, it's sticking through the surface of the material, which means it is definitely thicker than an inch. But let's go back and close out of this. We can go back and manage the thickness of the model inside the component window. So it's kind of important to understand is that the X and Y of a 3D model is edited in the design settings using that transform set tool rather, but the thickness of the 3D model is managed inside the component window. So I'm going to double click on this to open it up. And here we see the thickness has increased to 1 inch and 3.3. We want it to be 0.75. So let's change it to 0.75. That will not change the diameter. It only changes the thickness. And then the other thing we want is we want this to subtract. Right now, we saw it poking up out as a positive. It was set on merge, but we're going to change it to subtract, and we should get our dish shape. There we go. So we have our dish shape just the way we like it. We'll close out of that. And next, I want to add my bottle cap shape to that. I'm going to go back to clip art, go inside my objects and people, and here's the bottle cap right here. Double click. So once again, notice that it's inserted it, but it doesn't look correct in the 3D model. So we got to do a couple of things on this. Let's start out in the design field. And over here on the right, it shows that we want the bottle cap to be 7 inches tall. So let's open up the set size tool. We know the bottle cap is selected because it's dark in the 2D view and it's, red or green over here. That's the selected one. And the other way you know it's selected is that in the component window, it's highlighted. And if you have a hard time selecting it, go to the component window because you can very quickly select each object independently. Anyway, let's go back to the design window and change the XY size of this. In this case, I'm going to uncheck the Auto Z, and I'll show you how this is going to stay the same thickness. It's just going to get bigger in diameter. So let's change this to 7 inches. Hit apply. So notice it got larger diameter, but it didn't poke up anymore through the bottom because it's still the same thickness because I turned off the Auto Z. Close out of here. Go back to the component window. Open up the bottle cap by double clicking on it. And so let's look over here. It says here that we want a shape height of 1/4 inch and a base height. So these are two things that are important to understand the difference. We've got shape height and a base height. So before I do this, I'm going to turn off the dome and the material. So there's our bottle cap. So the height of the bottle cap, that's the bottle cap. That's called the shape. I want to change the shape height in this case to 1/4 inch, which actually makes it a lot flatter or thinner. But I also want to do what's called add base height. Base height, think of that as the foundation of a house. If I add 0.5, notice how it pops it up. The reason for that is that when I turn these two back on, it makes this whole cap visible through this area right here, through the dish. I'm going to do something a little different here. I'm going to take this base height to get rid of it. And of course, that disappears. Some people might say, well, why don't we do like we did with the fish? And we'll just do an add. And I can do that. I can do an add. And it adds it. But notice something that's a little odd here is that the top of this cap now is curved because it's adding that 1/4 inch thickness of the cap to the inside of this dome. So when you add something, it actually mimics the shape below it. In fact, if I took that and brought that up over the edge, see how it actually mimics the entire shape. It's literally just laying it like a layer of rubber on top of everything. And it's just conforming to everything below it. Since I want the top of this cap to be curved, or I don't want it to be curved, I want to put this on merge, and that will maintain the original shape of it, but it's hiding inside. So just like I talked about walking into the water, you go into the water that's too deep and your head goes underwater. We want to give this some foundation, kind of like standing on stilts in deep water. And if I add this foundation or this base height, it will then poke up that bottle cap up through that surface, and the bottle cap is flat on the top now. Now, it's also important to kind of understand the math that's going on here. So our bottle cap is 3/4 of an inch thick. And here's another little feature you can turn on. It's called showing the material thickness. So there's the material. And right now, our bottle cap is sticking up in the material. This is also showing me something else that's a little curious. It looks like the bottle cap is actually below the surface. There's an easy fix to this, but you just have to realize that sometimes it takes a while for V-carve to catch up with itself. So when you get a lot of models added like this, you can get kind of an anomaly like this where it's not really showing what it's supposed to show. So one way to fix this is, let's close this. I'm going to go over to that job setup I talked about. And notice how automatically, just by clicking on that, it made the correction. And now the model is sitting on the top of the green material. I can't quite explain why this happens. It's just one of those things you have to watch for. Now, had I not caught that, it would have self-corrected itself potentially when I started doing the toolpaths. But I do encourage people to be aware that this material setup window actually is a valuable window. And again, here, I can move that all the way up to the top, but I actually want that sitting on the bottom like that. Click OK. Now watch when I turn back on my material and my dome. So once again, everything is working out together. It doesn't look a whole lot different than it did before, but it does align with that little green box, which I turned off by clicking on this to show my material. Turn that material on and everything aligns. So back to the point I was trying to make about the math, is that if I turn off the dome and the material, my cap is 3/4 of an inch tall, 0.25 plus 0.5 for the base. My material is only an inch tall. So I only have a 1/4 inch of material to go above there to put my beer mug in. So to put the mug in, that's why the mug is a 1/4 inch thick. I'm going to click on the mug. Again, notice the mug is hiding. So let's go to the components. We want to add the mug to the top. So I can open that up, put it to add, and now we're on the top. And let's turn the dome back on and the material back on. And open the mug back up here a second. Okay, if I turn this up on edge a little bit, well, let's do this. Let's change this mug thickness to 0.375, which is thicker than we really want it. But notice when I turn this up on edge, you can see how the mug is sticking out above up here. And if we go back to our material setup, we're going to get an error because it says our model thickness, total model thickness is 1 1/8, and our material is only 1 inch. So something has to be fixed. And of course, where the problem lies is I made that mug thicker than spec. So let's change that back to the 1/4 inch. And the air goes away on the right side. So now we have our finished model. Now I covered a lot in this exercise, and that's a challenge in itself. There's a lot of things I went over here, but it's also the reason I like this exercise is because with a very simple project, it shows you, it gives you a chance to practice all these different little settings that are required for doing 3D models when you're combining things. Again, if you're just starting out with VCarve and cutting, just use a single model, and just carve it. Like if I just wanted to carve this mug, I could take that mug like that. I could go to my material setup and I could say, I want that mug at the top like that. And then when I did my carving, if I jump ahead to my finish carving here and just say do material boundaries, it'll carve that whole thing out. Let's remove that and get a new bit here. Takes a while to calculate the 3D finishing toolpaths. So now notice when I preview this, it's carved that out of the top of the material. So you could do simple carvings just with one 3D model and just a couple of toolpaths. But if you choose to do the setup that I'm showing you here, the last thing that we can do in here, which is going to show you one more technique that's pretty interesting, is I could go in here and notice that we've got some shears set up here, okay? I want to show you a couple other points here. If I'm going to select that disk, okay? Another very useful tool within 3D model setup is this first tool right here, which is called Create Vector Boundary. So if I click on that, notice I've created a circle, a vector. Now I could use that vector to set up my carving tool paths. First, we'll start with the roughing one. One setting we haven't talked about yet is this selected vector. So if I want to restrict my 3D carving to a certain area, I can create a vector. And now, since I don't really need to carve the surface of this, I just need to carve inside there. I select that vector I created, hit selected vectors underneath my 3D modeling toolpath, calculate it. And now it's just going to carve out in the middle. And I also could take my finishing one, open that one back up, turn the vectors back on. Let's see if I can turn those on. Let's see here, go back to 2D. And that vector is already selected. Hit selected vectors. And now I'm restricting my 3D toolpath to that vector as well. So I'm saving myself a lot of time by not carving this flat surface. Preview that. And then the last thing I want to do on this particular drawing is I want to add this text. So I'm going to go in, type in some text down here. Just insert some text and go cheers like that. I'm going to use the text on a curve, go into that, click text on a curve, and now notice it popped it to the other side. That's probably because the start point was over on this side of that circle. So I just simply could drag that around to the bottom. Let's scale that and shrink that back down, increase the text spacing a little bit. Actually, I need to make that a lot smaller. There we go. Also, I want to offset it from that edge a little bit. So that's where I'll go in to do some offset. Let's do a 1/4 inch in there, see how that looks. That looks pretty good, but I think, check this out over here. Okay. The other thing I'm going to do is use this feature here, which is keep the letters vertical. Now it just flipped it. So let's go here. Let's go back to there. Oops. So something's getting a little squirrely here. Let's see here. Well, now I've got myself an interesting situation going on here. Go above it. I'm going to back out of this a second to double check this curve, this circle. Aha! This is part of my problem. So what I have here, all these vectors, sometimes when you trace an object with that 3D tracing tool, you end up with lots of nodes. So in a situation like this, which is a better option, is I'm going to delete that since I know that's a nice circle, and I'm going to go into my circle tool and just create a circle that's 9 inches. And let's see, where did that go? Try it again. We'll do a bottle cap demo. Okay. Okay. So there's the circle. I had to click on there. It didn't do it automatically. So now I'm going to double check settings here to make sure that's centered. I'll hit centered like that. So that should be centered now. That looks good. Okay. Now when I go into my circle and I go into node edit, there's my start point at the top. So this lettering should insert itself more predictably than before. And there we go. That's what I want. So let's just decrease that size a little bit further. Okay, I'm going to try that. Oh yeah, I wanted to make those vertical also. So I go back into the text on a curve and click vertical. This is where it went weird before. Okay, now it's okay. So what you just saw there was something was acting odd, and I still can't quite explain it. I saw all those nodes. So you saw that I was clicking back and forth pretty rapidly trying to figure out what was going on. And sometimes when you run into a situation like that, just back out, go in a different door, try it a different way, redo it. And as you saw, now everything worked as I expected it to work. Every so often, you'll get a situation where your file simply doesn't work. And sometimes, and I've had this happen, I'm going to say once or twice a year, maybe, I'll get a file that'll just basically seems like it's corrupt. And I just go back in and I recreate the file in a new, I open up a brand new file and I just recreate it. And I just basically trash the old one. I first try to save the old one, but if I can't, I'll just recreate it. So what I did here is I tried to save this one and it did work. Usually it's my error. Usually I've overlooked something or screwed something up, but every so often the software can glitch and cause that problem. Okay, I'm going to finish up this one, show you this. So for this one, I'm going to use a VCarve toolpath. And the only thing that's unique here, let's use the use a 60-degree V-bit. Let's use this one. Use a 60-degree for detail. I'm selecting that text. I'm going to select this option down here, which shows project toolpath on 3D model. And notice now when we turn this up, notice how that toolpath is laying right there in the curve. If I don't use that, then what happens is the toolpath lays on the surface of the material and it's not going to cut into it. As you can see there, it's not going to cut into it. So we need to project that onto the 3D model, and then it lays it down onto that curve like that. And then if we preview it, we've added a little bit of text to it. Okay, I'm going to cover one more thing tonight before we wrap up. It's the creating custom shapes. And this is actually pretty straightforward, but it actually shows you some of the custom power that VCarve has available to it. So this shape is actually made up of some of those same domes or discs that I showed you before. So I'm going to go in, clip art, get the dome and dish. Let's use this one. The difference between these, kind of as it illustrates, is that this first one is a very low profile and this is a higher profile. Once you start adjusting the thickness, it doesn't matter too much, but the edge on this first one has a much gentler slope to it, and the edge on this deeper one has a sharper slope to it. So I usually use a couple of the middle ones for the shapes that I use. I'm going to use this one right now. And if we split this image, and you can see how that's a much sharper, larger shape. Now, I'm going to go in and edit that right off because my material is only 3/4 of an inch thick. So I'm going to make this component 0.25. Let's start with that. Well, actually, let's make it 0.5. There we go. That's what I want. Okay. So there's our component. Now, what's kind of interesting about any of these shapes inside here is you can take that shape and you can manually grab it here and shrink it like that. And if you want to do it more precisely, you could go inside here and edit it. So I'm going to undo that shape back to where it was in the full circle. We made that a 1/2 inch thick. I want to make sure that 1/2 inch thickness is maintained. So I'm going to uncheck the Auto Z. I'm going to uncheck this, and I'm going to make the width, let's say 4 inches, and apply. And maybe I'll make the height 6 inches and apply, stretch it a little bit. And let's jerk this down to 3.5. Try that, make it a little slimmer. Okay, so I've got that. If I go into my component window, I have a dome. It's set at merge. I'm going to right click on this and duplicate that. So notice how I have two domes up here, and right now they're sitting on top of each other. I'm going to select the first dome like that. Now here's a shortcut key that you'll want to learn. It's really handy. The 9 key or the 0 key will rotate these counterclockwise or clockwise. So I hit the 9 key and it counterclockwise, 1 click, 2 clicks, and it clicks them. Now you can see on the right side, since these are both set to merge, they are intersecting each other with that new shape. And so I've created this unique shape. And to that, then I can add the fish. Click on the fish. And once again, we see the fish is hiding inside. So let's go in and change the fish. And I'm right clicking up here to get this shortcut for the add mode. And then I want to make the fish a little smaller. So I'm going to go into my set size. I'm going to link it. I'm going to auto scale this. I'm not sure what that'll do exactly, but we'll go ahead and change this width on this fish to, let's change it down to maybe 5 inches, see how that looks. Let's make a lot smaller than that, I guess. Something like that, maybe up just a little bit more. And then again, if you wanted to get a little custom on this, you could change that fish. We could take the height here, uncheck this, and make the height, say 2 inches, and just make it a little chubbier in height. So that's, again, some of the editing capabilities you have. And then these other parts, whether it's the star pockets or the lettering, are the same way we did in the last one, where I created the vectors, and then in the toolpath, I said apply to 3D model, and then it carves it down to the shape, to the 3D model. Now, one other thing I want to point out is that this is coming down flat, and this one has a little edge to it. So here's something we could do in the component window. I can take that dome, open it up, and I can add a little base height to that of 0.25. And maybe that's a little too much. Let's double check something here. Oh, it said 0.25. Let's put it 1/8 of an inch instead. There we go. Select the other one. And let's add that as well, 0.125 for the base height. And then on the fish, it looks a little thick. So let's go in and change that down to a 0.25 for the thickness. Close out of that. And so now we have added some added detail. Let me enlarge this one. Now, like I said, we go to set the tool paths, but one of the things you want to check along the way is this material setup. And I'm probably going to get an error, sure. So it's showing me that my material is 0.75, my model thickness is 0.86. Now, in a situation like this, I don't necessarily, I could go back and change up the models, the individual components, and make this work. But there's also this really great feature when you have your whole model completed like this, where I just have to shrink it down by a little bit. This set button allows me to shrink everything proportionately. So if I type in 0.75, it'll take that whole assembly and shrink it all equally. So it compresses it. And so it shrunk everything just a little bit. And now it fits. And now I'm good to go for setting up my tool paths. And I'm going to say no, because I'm not going to tool path this. It'll take a while. But there's lots of tool paths you can add to this. Going back to what we did earlier, I could add some vectors around the outside to cut it out. Lots of other things I could do. Any questions about that?
Yeah, I've got one. Will the 3D modeling work on an older version of my software? I'm running 10.5.
Pretty much everything I've showed you here, you can still do in 10.5, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe, in fact, I think everything I've showed you here, you can still do in 10.5. Some of the tool setups are going to look a little different over here in the left side and in the component window. And you may have a separate window for these 3D modeling tools that I'm showing here at the bottom. They used to have their own separate tab, and the tabs maybe were named something different, but all this functionality should be in 10.5.
All right, I gotta set up and carve a beer cap.
All right. Anybody else? All right. Once again, you'll have my email. I'll get this video out to you sometime tomorrow. If you're brand new to 3D carving, some of the easy, give you one last tip on this. If you select, see that middle fish right there? I'm gonna get rid of those. If you select this middle fish, you're gonna get what looks like a fish in a dish right off the start. And if you were to go in and, again, since all I have here is that model, you could then just do model boundaries and it'll just carve that. And you're going to end up with a fish in the dish, pretty much the same as I showed before. Now, what happened here? I didn't check my material setup. So let's go look at material setup here. There we go. Move that up to the top, say okay. I'll recalculate that rough. And there we go. Now I'm going to get what I want. So that's the roughing for the fish. So you don't have to go through all the steps I showed tonight for some of these carvings. But I wanted to give everybody a pretty good overview of 3D carving because it is incredibly powerful within VCarve. You don't need a Spire to do this. Anybody else tonight? Okay, then. Well, thanks everybody for hanging in there. Oh, another question? Yes.
Yeah, I got a couple questions.
Good.
Last session when we talked about tool bits,
Yes.
you were talking about 1 or 2 flute. What about spiral bits?
Well, often 1 or 2 fluted bits are often spiraled as well. Now, generally, an up spiral bit is kind of the go-to for lots of types of work, and it's a great bit to use. I use an up spiral bit for almost all my cutting and carving when I use a 1/4 inch diameter. It's very effective because it has a shearing action. It leaves a smoother edge cut. The only drawback of an up cut is that in plywood and solid wood, it can lift the grain at the top surface. So you sometimes have to take that into consideration when you're doing your carving. Sometimes if you set that first pass real shallow, or if you go a climb cut, then you can avoid the chipping. A down spiral bit is a more unique bit, and it has a couple specific situations. One is if you're cutting through material that has real sensitive veneer on the top, then a down spiral bit will make that clean cut guaranteed. The other way a down spiral bit is most useful that I use it for is when I'm cutting 1/8 inch plywood, because that down spiral actually pushes down in that thin plywood and keeps that plywood from lifting up, which an up spiral would. For roughing, like you see in the photo right here in the presentation, I will sometimes use a straight bit for this, a straight flute, a single or double flute, 1/2 inch, 3/8, 1/4 inch. I will use that for that. But for most of my fine cutting, I use an up spiral, either single or double flute. Again, thank you for hanging in there. You'll have my email. You have questions about the 3D carving. If you're running a 3D carve, you run into a toolpath problem or a combined problem, send me a copy of your file, describe your problem. I can probably help you out pretty quickly, no charge. If you're looking for more in-depth product design, I am available for, by the hour for the hire, if that interests you, but just drop me an email either way, and we can see what works best. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you.